The news ticker kept crawling across the bottom of the screen, but I wasn't watching it anymore. I already knew what it said. Everyone did. Grain Hospitality Group hits a valuation of $580 million. I stood in my corner office, arms crossed, staring out at Boston's skyline. 5 years ago, this city didn't know my name. 5 years ago, I was invisible. Now my company logo glowed from billboards, and investors returned my calls within minutes. I was 29 years old, and nothing in this room had been handed to me. My phone buzzed on the desk. I expected congratulations. A message from a board member. Maybe Julian checking in. Instead, it was a text that made my stomach tighten on instinct. Edward, family dinner, 7:00 p.m., urgent, don't be late. No greeting, no warmth, just a command. The same tone he'd used my entire childhood. For a moment, my body reacted before my mind could stop it. A flicker of anxiety, a pressure behind my ribs, the ghost of fear from a time when disappointing him felt like suffocating. 5 years ago, that text would have controlled me. 5 years ago, Edward Ashford threw me out of his house for marrying a man he considered beneath our name. He locked the estate gates, cut me off from the family trust, and made sure every door connected to his influence slammed shut behind me. Julian, my husband, was a talented architect, but Edward refused to acknowledge that. To him, Julian was just the draftsman, a man without money, power, or pedigree. Edward wanted us to break, and for a while, it almost worked. Julian and I survived on instant noodles and day-old bread. We slept on a mattress on the floor of a tiny apartment that smelled like damp plaster. We renovated our first boutique hotel ourselves, painting walls at midnight, fixing pipes with borrowed tools, learning everything the hard way. Edward thought hunger would send me crawling back. He never understood that hunger builds teeth. I looked back at the text message, my thumb hovering over the delete button. I didn't owe him my time. I didn't owe him forgiveness. I certainly didn't owe him dinner. Then I opened my encrypted messages. Lucas, my younger brother, still living in the mansion, still pretending to be loyal, still quietly watching everything. 2 days earlier, Lucas had sent me a photo of a wrinkled document he'd pulled from the trash in Edward's private study, a default notice from a private equity firm that specialized in short-term, high-interest bridge loans. The amount was circled in red, $28 million, due within 48 hours, personally guaranteed. That was when everything clicked. Edward wasn't calling me to reconnect. He was calling because he was drowning. He had seen the valuation headline. He had seen my name flash across business channels. And in his mind, I wasn't a daughter, I was a bailout, a resource, a solution he could bully into saving him. I set my phone down and walked back to my desk. Instead of calling Julian, instead of calling a friend, I called my lead counsel. I want you to buy the debt, I said calmly. The shell company holding the note. Pay whatever premium they demand. I want it transferred to my name before 6. There was a pause on the line. That's aggressive, he said. I know. When the call ended, I stepped into the elevator and watched my reflection in the mirrored doors. The woman staring back at me looked calm, focused, dangerous in a quiet way. The frightened girl Edward used to control was gone. Tonight, I wasn't going to my father's house as his daughter. I was going as his creditor. The mansion dining room was exactly as I remembered, cold, polished, and tense. My mother sat beside me, twisting her napkin without looking up. Lucas sat across the table, eyes fixed on his plate, jaw tight. Edward sat at the head, already pouring himself an expensive glass of wine. His hand shook, just enough to notice. I saw the news, he said casually, cutting into his steak. Success can make people delusional. His eyes lifted to mine. Tell me, is the draftsman still pretending he belongs in your world? I didn't react. I watched the sweat on his upper lip. The way his gaze flicked toward the clock on the wall. The way his confidence felt rehearsed, forced. Then he slid a thick envelope across the table. You have 5 minutes, he said smoothly, to sign over control of your company, or I make a call. I opened the envelope. Psychiatric evaluations, a conservatorship petition, a plan to declare me mentally unfit and take everything I'd built. Edward leaned back, smiling. He thought this was checkmate. I closed the folder, reached under my chair, and placed a heavy legal binder on the table. You're wrong, I said quietly. I didn't come here to surrender. I met his eyes. I came to end this. Edward believed he was about to destroy his daughter's future. He had no idea dinner had just turned into the beginning of his collapse. Edward stared at the legal binder like it was an unexploded device. For the first time since I'd entered the dining room, his smug confidence cracked. You think this is funny? He scoffed, but the sound came out thin. You're playing a dangerous game, Graina. I didn't smile. I didn't argue. I opened the binder and slid it across the table so the first page faced him. The words were bold, clinical, unforgiving. Notice of debt transfer and right to accelerate. The color drained from his face so fast it looked unnatural. That's confidential. He snapped, reaching for the page. It was, I replied calmly. Until you missed your payment window. His jaw tightened. You don't understand what you're looking at. I understand it perfectly. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands. 6 months ago, when no traditional bank would touch you, you took a bridge loan from a private equity firm operating through a shell company. High interest, short term, backed by your personal guarantee. Silence. You pledged collateral, I continued. Not property, not cash. Control. Edward laughed sharp and forced. You're bluffing. Am I? I turned another page. The loan was secured against 51% of your voting shares. I said. Which means default doesn't take months. It takes minutes. My mother sucked in a quiet breath beside me. Edward's hand trembled as he read. How did you even? They sold the note. I interrupted. Last week. Quietly. They assumed you'd fold. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. I bought it. The words landed heavy. Final. Edward pushed back from the table, chair legs screeching against the floor. This is fraud, he barked. You can't just. I can, I said. And I did. He lunged for the binder. Lucas stood up so fast his chair tipped. Dad, stop. Edward shoved him hard. Lucas stumbled into the sideboard, glass shattering as a crystal decanter hit the floor. My mother gasped. I didn't move. Edward clawed at the pages like a man trying to tear his own sentence out of existence. His breathing grew ragged. Desperate. I picked up my phone. One word waited in a pre-drafted message to my legal team. Execute. You won't dare? Edward snarled, sweat streaking his temples. You think a piece of paper makes you powerful. I pressed send. Don't. I said quietly. Edward froze. That binder is a courtesy copy, I continued. The real documents were filed electronically 30 seconds ago. Default acceleration. Public record. I tapped the table once. The clock already ran out. His phone buzzed, then mine, then Lucas's. The sound filled the room like a countdown alarm. Edward looked at his screen, eyes darting as notifications stacked faster than he could read them. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. That's the board, I said. They've been notified of a change in control. You can't do this, he whispered. I built that company. You leveraged it, I corrected, to cover your bad bets. He shook his head violently. I have assets, the house, accounts. The house takes time, I replied. I didn't want time. I stood, smoothing my dress, my movements unhurried. You pledged your voting shares as collateral. Under commercial law, a secured creditor can seize control immediately upon default. I stepped closer until he could smell my perfume instead of his own fear. I'm the creditor. His phone buzzed again, louder this time. He didn't answer. I now control the board, I continued. The building, the accounts. I met his eyes. I control you. Edward collapsed into his chair like his bones had given up. The man who once ruled every room he entered now looked small, shrinking inside an expensive suit that couldn't protect him anymore. He turned to my mother. Constance, he rasped. Tell her this is madness. My mother didn't move, didn't speak. She looked at me instead, and in her eyes, I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear and awe. You're finished, I said calmly. Effective immediately. Edward's hands fell into his lap. For the first time in his life, he had nothing left to threaten me with. Edward spent decades ruling through fear and leverage. Tonight, he learned what it feels like to face someone who learned from him, and improved the technique. The room stayed silent after my words settled. Edward sat frozen, staring at the glowing screen of his phone, like it had betrayed him personally. The man who once controlled entire boardrooms with a raised eyebrow, now couldn't even form a sentence. For decades, he had been the loudest voice in every room. Now, he had none. You don't understand what you've done, he said finally, his voice hoarse. This company is my life. I tilted my head slightly. No, it was your shield. He looked up at me, eyes bloodshot. I made you, he snapped. Every opportunity you ever had, every connection, came from my name. That's the lie you needed to believe, I replied calmly. Because if you weren't the source of everything, you'd have to admit something worse. He frowned. What? That you failed to break me. Edward stood again, unsteady now, like gravity had shifted under his feet. You think this is victory? He shouted. You think you've won? His voice cracked, and the sound echoed strangely in the massive dining room. I looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. This isn't revenge, I said. This is correction. My mother finally moved. She set her napkin down carefully, as if afraid of making noise. Her hands trembled, but she didn't look at Edward. She looked at me. You planned this, she whispered. I nodded. He forced me to learn how. Edward turned to her, panic flashing across his face. Constance, say something. Tell her this is insanity. My mother swallowed. For 30 years, she had smoothed his rages, justified his cruelty, and absorbed his temper like it was her job. Tonight, the math had changed. She didn't speak. That silence landed harder than any scream. Edward laughed then, but it was broken, sharp, unhinged. You think you're strong now? He sneered. Without me, you're nothing. Investors will abandon you. The board will eat you alive. They already voted, I said softly. His laughter stopped, unanimously. The word crushed him. He sank back into his chair, hands gripping the armrests like they were the last solid things left in his world. You used doctors. I continued. You forged reports. You tried to lock me away. That was leverage? He spat. That's how the world works. No, I said. That's how you work. I leaned closer. And tonight, it stopped. Edward's breathing grew shallow. You wouldn't dare prosecute me, he said, searching my face for mercy. I'm your father. I straightened. You stopped being that a long time ago. I picked up my purse and turned toward the door. You have 30 days to vacate the executive suite, I said over my shoulder. Security revokes your access at midnight. Tomorrow, you may return with an escort to collect personal items. He stood abruptly. You can't throw me out of my own building? I can, I replied. Ed, I am. Behind me, a chair scraped violently. You ungrateful, Edward screamed, his voice breaking into something raw and ugly. I didn't turn around. Some men only understand power when it leaves them. The night air hit my face as I stepped outside. Cold, clean, free. For the first time in years, my lungs filled completely. I didn't look back at the mansion. You never watch a burning building once you've escaped it. Home was quiet when I arrived. The city hummed below our balcony. The smell of garlic and basil drifted through the air. Julian stood at the stove, stirring sauce in an old, paint-stained shirt. He glanced over his shoulder and smiled like it was an ordinary night. Hey, he said. I made your favorite. I crossed the room and pressed my forehead against his shoulder. The tension I'd been holding all evening finally released. Not as tears, but as breath. It's over, I whispered. He wrapped his arms around me. Steady, solid, safe. We're free, he said. We ate quietly, watching the city lights blink on like stars. For the first time, Edward Ashford wasn't part of my future, and that was the real victory. Edward lost his empire in one night, but the real consequences of his choices were still coming, and he hadn't seen the worst of it yet. 3 months later, the office no longer smelled like him. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped into the executive suite for the first time as CEO. The air felt lighter, less polished wood and old cologne, more sunlight and fresh paint. The windows were the same floor, tip-ceiling glass Edward had insisted on years ago, but the city outside them felt different now. It felt honest. The name on the door had changed. Not Ashford Financial, not his legacy, mine. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the silence settle. Power, I'd learned, wasn't loud. It didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, steady and unshaken. My assistant knocked softly. The architects are here for the walkthrough? Send them in, I said. Julian entered first, blueprints tucked under his arm, eyes bright with the same quiet excitement he'd had when we renovated our first tiny hotel. He rolled the plans across my desk, already talking about light, flow and space, about building something meant to last. I watched him for a moment before smiling. This was the man Edward tried to erase. This was the future he failed to imagine. The board meeting that afternoon was brief and decisive. Audits approved. Restructuring confirmed. The company didn't wobble without Edward at the helm. It exhaled. Investors didn't flee. They stayed. Some even admitted they'd been waiting. Fear had been expensive. Clarity was profitable. Edward didn't attend, of course. By the end of the first week, his access cards were dead, his office emptied, his name quietly removed from internal systems like outdated software. There was no public spectacle, no dramatic headlines, just absence. That night, a small padded envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was a pair of pearl earrings, my grandmother's, the only thing my mother had ever truly loved from that house. The note was short. She would have wanted you to have these. No apology, no explanation, but it was enough. I wore them the next morning, not as sentiment, but as reminder. Not of where I came from, but of what survived. Edward called once. I didn't answer. Some conversations expire when their purpose ends. Weeks passed. Then months. The company grew, faster than analysts predicted. Not because I chased revenge, but because I chased alignment. People worked better without fear hanging over every decision. Creativity returned. Loyalty followed. At home, life stayed simple. Julian cooked. I worked late. We argued about paint colors and laughed about the idea of getting a dog we were never home enough to train. On quiet nights, we sat on the balcony, watching the city glow beneath us like it was still surprised to see me there. Sometimes, I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed survival meant obedience. I wished I could tell her one thing. You don't win by becoming like them. You win by becoming untouchable. On a clear morning in early spring, I stood in the lobby of our newest property as sunlight poured through the glass ceiling. Guests moved easily through the space, unaware of the wars that had funded the walls around them. That was the point. True power doesn't need witnesses. It builds quietly, corrects firmly, moves on without looking back. I checked my phone. A message from Lucas. He moved out today. I smiled, not because Edward had fallen, but because the cycle had ended. Some legacies are inherited, others are dismantled. I adjusted the pearls at my ears and walked forward, heels steady against the marble floor. I wasn't carrying my father's name anymore. I was carrying my own, and this time, it fit. They say you can't choose your family, but you can choose when their control ends, and what you build after the silence.